So hello and welcome to the event for this evening. My name is Rachel Hewitt and I am Director of the Newcastle Centre for the Literary Arts. It's really lovely that you could all join us this evening. I don't know about you, but here it really feels like there's spring in the air. There's shoots and bulbs coming up in the garden, and it feels so necessary after such a long cold winter. And I think that the book for tonight, Cal Flyn's Islands of Abandonment, Life in the Post-Human Landscape, is this kind of perfect read for this sense of nature's capacity to reclaim spaces that have been given up for lost. But before introducing tonight's event, I'd just like to quickly describe what else we've got coming up over the next few months. Next week, on Thursday, the 25th of February, the film critic, columnist, and youngest ever member of the Society for Psychical Research, Roger Clark, will be speaking about his best-selling book, The Natural History of Ghosts, 300 Years of Searching for Proof. Roger's book is a fascinating account of how the types of ghosts that we see and search for change throughout history, reflecting shifting cultural values over time. One of my favourite lines from the book is a comment made by the 18th century antiquarian Francis Grose, who declared that dragging chains is not the fashion of English ghosts, but rather of foreign spectres. Dead or alive, he wrote, English spirits are free. A fortnight after that, on the 11th of March, we are proud to be hosting the Poetry Book Society's Spring Choice of Poets, featuring Jen Hadfield, who will be reading from her collection, The Stone Age, which explores neurodiversity, and Rowan Ricardo Phillips, who will be reading from Living Weapon, described by Granta as a piercing, flaring collection from a virtuoso poetic voice. Later in March, that theme of ghosts resurfaces when novelist Natasha Pulley will be talking about her latest book, The Lost Future of Pepper Harrow, a historical novel set in Japan, described by a reviewer as a lovely blending of steampunk ether science, Japanese historical figures, and a time-defying thriller. After Easter, we have 3 more brilliant events for you. Continuing our series of sort of tag team or passing the baton events, Charlie Gilmore, who spoke about his wonderful book, Featherhood, last semester, will be in conversation with US biographer Blake Bailey about his forthcoming biography of Philip Roth. Then in May, the novelist Niven Govindan will be talking about his forthcoming novel, Diary of a Film, which is a novel about cinema, flâneurs, and queer love, and about stories and who has the right to tell them. And then finally, to end the season, we have multi-award-winning novelist John McGregor, who will be talking about his forthcoming novel, Lean, Fall, Stand, an engrossing exploration of an Antarctic researcher brought low by tragedy and desperate to communicate with the outside world. All of these events will be online and free to attend, but you do need to register. So to do so, please visit our website, which is www.newcastle.ac.uk/NCLA. Well, this brings me to tonight's event, and it's a huge pleasure to be hosting the author and journalist Cal Flyn, who will be in conversation with Ella Mershon. Cal is an award-winning non-fiction writer whose first book, Thicker Than Water, retraced the journey made by a distant relative, Angus Macmillan, as he fled the Highland clearances for the Australian bush. Macmillan was feted as a pioneer hero in his lifetime, but has more recently been implicated as a ringleader of a number of brutal massacres of the Aboriginal people. Cal's book is subtitled History, Secrets and Guilt, and asks the question, has today's generation inherited a responsibility to atone for our ancestors' sins? Thicker Than Water was selected as one of the Times' best books of the year, but she's here tonight to talk about her second book, Islands of Abandonment, Life in the Post-Human Landscape, which explores extraordinary places where humans no longer live or survive in tiny, precarious numbers. Chernobyl, a no longer habited Scottish island, neighbourhoods of Detroit. Her book brings together some of the most desolate, eerie, ravaged and polluted areas in the world. And it shows what nature gets up to when we're not there to see it, and how, against all odds, these islands of abandonment may offer our best opportunities for environmental recovery. She has an ideal interlocutor tonight in Newcastle University's Ella Mershon, lecturer in Victorian literature, whose own research is fascinated by questions of natural decay, dust, fungus, and by hope too, in addressing the precarity of our planet's habitability. Ella and Cal are going to be in conversation tonight for just under an hour. If you've got any questions that you'd like to ask during the conversation, please put them into the YouTube chat, which should be on the right-hand side of the page. And you don't need to wait until the end of the event to put them into the chat. Please feel free to just write them down as they occur to you. I'm really excited to hear tonight's conversation, which seems to speak to so much that's kind of on our present minds. Isolation, recovery, nature coming back. So tonight I'm going to hand over to you, Ella and Cal. I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us here. I'm so thrilled to have the opportunity to speak with Cal, whose book spoke to me in so many ways. And as I was telling her earlier, it was an absolute pleasure to get to go with her on a journey to these remote, unsung, and yet beautiful locations. So we're going to kick off with Cal doing a reading from her book before we move into our conversation. So Cal, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Ella. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here this evening. Yes, we thought we'd kick off with a short reading from the book itself before we have a conversation about it. And so generally, when I talk about Islands of Abandonment, the way I sum it up most succinctly is to describe it as a book about the ecology and the psychology of abandoned places. So the majority of the book looks at how nature reclaims spaces that we've left behind, how nature rebounds and recovers and adapts. But there's also a strand in there about how it affects us as people, how abandoned places make us feel and how they change the way that we act. So I'm going to read a little bit from that section here just to kick us off and hopefully sort of create the mood. It's from a section called Days of Anarchy, and it's set in Paterson, New Jersey, which is a post-industrial city in America. In an urban environment, entering an abandoned space is the nearest thing we have to stepping off the map. It offers anonymity, the succor of green space, without the order, the omnipresence of man, so implicit in a park or garden. An urban ruin might offer an effect upon the mind akin to slipping into the dark forest or scaling a rugged peak, that same wild element. And we might seek it out for similar reasons. Amidst the crumbling mills and towering, blackened chimneys, the skeletal remains of industrial giants, I feel a flickering, a stirring of the soul. The shadow of the sublime passes overhead. Seen through this prism, the drugs baggies, the bloodied needles, the spray-painted trees, even the grimy encampments could be symbols not of a community in decline, but of an extreme anarchic liberty. What Anais Nin said, in chaos there is fertility. There is more than one kind of freedom, as Aunt Lydia tells her captive audience in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Freedom to and freedom from. In their new theocratic state of Gilead, the apprentice handmaidens are being given freedom from objectification, freedom from certain kinds of danger. In the days of anarchy, as Lydia calls them, meaning the before times, now, it was freedom to, and I've never seen the latter so clearly epitomized as in the unkempt wilderness grown up around the old colt mill. It's an instantly comprehensible demonstration, a defining of terms. There's no authority here to defy. To be here is to experience a raw kind of exhilaration laced with fear. There is a thrill in finding safe passage through a place with no safety rail, empowerment in the experience of self-determination in the extreme. But without the structure and strictures of normal society, the sense of possibility is so strong as to feel dizzying. I could do anything, you think. I could be anyone, and no one will stop me. One realizes very quickly how thin the threads that hold our identities in place might be. Perhaps we only know who we truly are in a place where no one tells us what to do.
Thank you so much for sharing that part. That reminds me of a couple other bits and passages in your book. It reminds me of you talking about being in Chernobyl, and I think at the end of that chapter you talk about your sense of self-blurring, kind of melting away. And I absolutely kind of love that sense that like that the processes of decay were somehow kind of melting away part of you in the process as well. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the main things. I mean, one of the things that I wanted to talk about in the book is that draw to abandoned places that so many of us feel. It's got a sort of magnetic, I don't know, an attraction and repulsion at the same time. And that I think it's that sense of boundaries blurring and of being part of an enormous expanse of time and how we dissolve into it. I think that's definitely part of the feeling that sort of thrills us and horrifies us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that this sense of possibility, right? At one point you describe the air being full of kind of life's latency, which I love that phrase, that there's just a sort of kind of latent potentiality kind of drifting around us that we can't see until we go into these empty spaces, and there kind of the latency can take hold. But I actually wanted to start by actually just asking a more general question that I think you've already opened up for us, which is a question just about emotion, right? Because as a reader, I really did feel quite strongly, kind of have different emotional responses. As you were saying, kind of there was kind of a thrill or a frisson, like sense of being in a forbidden area, or occasionally there would be a kind of melancholy of seeing the ravages of war. And I guess but that was sort of, I'm getting that secondhand, but you were there on the ground. And I wonder if you could maybe talk to us a bit about what it was like to actually be in these spaces, and what did you feel when you kind of witnessed these various forms of destruction and you know, war-torn countries, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, going to the places that I was writing about was really important. I guess that's why I've structured the book. For those who haven't had a chance to read it yet, it's 12 or, well, I suppose 13 different locations, each of which is sort of profiled, and each of which offers a sort of different aspect of this idea of abandonment that I want to dig into. Each of them's got a different sort of story to it that I think illuminates an aspect of biology or psychology. And yeah, I think all of them, I worried at the beginning of this project that overwhelmingly that the tone of the writing would be somehow miserable or depressing, you know, and I think it's written on the back of the book, you know, it's sort of the eeriest and most desolate places, and absolutely that was part of it. But I think the experience of actually going to these places and to feel them is very key. And I took a different sense away from each one. I mean, some were genuinely quite frightening, and oddly not always the most dangerous places. I think the place where I was the most frightened was the island of Swona in Scotland, a place where I was almost certainly safe the entire time I was there. And I knew that in my right mind, but it's an abandoned island off the north coast of Scotland, between where I live, which is Orkney, and John O'Groats. And it's been abandoned since the 1970s, and it had a very sort of gothic sense of horror, my time there, because I was left there alone for a period of 24 hours. And although I'm quite used to spending long periods of time on my own, that intense, almost irreversible type of solitude of being really alone with animals on that island did play very strange tricks on my mind. So there were periods when I felt very frightened, but also periods in a number of these places when I came away feeling deeply affected in a sort of positive way. I think I touched on this a little bit in that reading there, but that impact that going to some of these places had on me was very much like, you know, climbing a great mountain or spending time in a dark forest, you know, all of these things which I enjoy doing and seek out and do a lot in my spare time. The way that a place can sort of touch inside you and sort of thrill you a little bit. And also I would come away feeling very optimistic and cheered by the sort of plant life or wildlife that I saw there. So I think it did run the sort of full gamut of emotions while researching this book. And I think that was something I very much wanted to get across in the writing, that sense of place, that sense of personal emotional journey. You know, I really feel very strongly that to write about place, you almost need to have an epiphany in every place that you're writing about. You know, you need to go there and then you need to hang around until something really dawns on you, and that drives you to write, and that drives the whole narrative of that section. And so sometimes you can go to a place and you're just like, oh, you know, fine, there's leaves, there's, you know, you take notes, but it's not affecting you deep down, and you've got to hang out there. And you've got to be in that place. And if you've got to sleep overnight there, that's what you've got to do. You know, you've just got to be there until it seeps into you somehow. And then your feeling that you take away from that place, that atmosphere, is very important for everything else. You know, the whole of the book feeds off that. And often, you know, the rational argument that you build off the back of that, it all comes from a sort of ineffable place to begin with that you just have to experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I guess I'm not surprised that you said that Swana was the place where you're most frightened, because I was like, it had all of the kind of mechanisms of Gothic horror. And there was that tent. I was so worried that there was somebody going to be in that tent. But so, yeah, I think, you know, that really came through, that you were having different emotional reactions. But that there was this sort of surprising sense of joy and hope that emerged in these abandoned places. And I think that was incredibly powerful, especially because I think, gosh, I mean, this is so often my sentiment these days when thinking about environmental destruction and environmental harm. It's one of doom and gloom. And so I was just, it was such medicine to read your words and to find hope again. So, you know, thank you for that. Thank you for giving me hope in these dark days. I was actually wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how you chose the particular locations that you chose. Because some of them, you know, as a reader, I was like, oh yes, like Chernobyl, Detroit, I know these, I know their destruction, I know their devastation. But others, I was like, oh my God, I never heard of this place. This is amazing. And then others, you know, and then I was thinking, oh gosh, I bet there was like a huge list of places that she could have considered. So I was wondering if you could talk through, like, you know, what is it about these particular landscapes that brought you to them, and how and why did you choose them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll just bring the list in front of me. So the main thing was that I felt that each place had to, they had to come together to create a bigger argument. You know, it wasn't going to be enough to talk about the story of one place after another and how it had declined, and then move on to the next place and talk about how it declined. What I was hoping to do, and you kind of touched on it there when you talked about optimism and hope, was construct an argument that looked at the natural powers of recovery. I mean, this is a kind of qualified optimism, I think, as you learn if you read to the end, because certainly the question of climate change is a big, almost unanswered question. But in terms of the damage that we've done to the planet, which is enormous, can we recover? And every time I looked into these sort of anthropogenic landscapes, as I came to sort of think of them, the answer was always yes. You know, even in these most polluted, most ravaged places that have been stripped clean of their natural resources, there was always some form of, you know, light coming through the cracks. And to begin with, I was a little bit nervous about going down this sort of hope, optimism path, and I didn't want to sort of be Pollyanna-ish about it. But I did find that, so say with the Bings chapter, so these are spoil heaps in an area of Scotland, but also there are similar locations, you know, around the UK, including specifically in Wales, in North Wales. There are, well, all over Wales, there are sort of colliery heaps where you find a similar thing. So what I wanted to look at there was to look at primary succession, which is just sort of basic way in which a sort of wrecked environment might regrow. So this is starting from bare ground, no soil, this kind of thing. And you learn about this in sort of ecology 101. You might hear about this in high school. This is as you talked about, the sort of latency of life that we have drifting around, how life comes to sort of recolonize areas that's been stripped from. So what I needed for that place, that chapter, was to find somewhere where we were starting from scratch. So we need like a man-made equivalent to a volcanic island, which is where we might see processes of primary succession coming into play in the natural world. And of course, it's the same natural forces that are recolonizing man-made sort of scars on the landscape. And I found them in the Bings, which were part of the landscape of me growing up. They're just outside of Edinburgh, where I spent a lot of time as a child, and I'm very close to where my uncle and aunt live. And they're these huge sort of gravel-like cliffs almost. They're just all over the landscape in West Lothian in Scotland. And the more I read about them, the more fascinated I came by them. And it turned out that a local ecologist had made studies of this area, and she'd sort of seen how they came to move from these like sterile heaps of gravel to being sort of these, she called them island refugia, for biodiversity. And I think that that's kind of where this sense of the islands of abandonment came in from, because in some cases they're real islands, and in some other cases they're sort of what should I call it, like metaphoric islands. You know, you can think of them as being islands of wildness sort of floating around in these like intensively managed landscapes. So that's one that I knew that I had to talk about. And in Cyprus, in the buffer zone, I knew that I wanted to talk about no man's lands, or places where in the past there was a sort of really interesting study about how during the exploration of America by British, or by then the sort of Americans themselves, they had explorers passing through areas where there were sort of no man's lands between various Native American tribes. And so I knew of this effect, which was that wildlife tended to do well in war zones, in these sort of areas of stasis. And so I was looking for a real life example. And so I think this is how I tended to pick these places. I had this sense of how the argument might progress, and then I needed to find real life examples, and ideally real life examples which also had sort of interesting human stories as well. And it took quite a long time for the shape of the book to settle. And I think, you know, even the order in which I wanted to tell them didn't really quite fall into place, even until the night that I was sort of handing in the book. I was still switching things around and trying to get it right. But I knew that I had to have this sense of the different locations quite early on, because I needed to travel there, and I needed to know about them and do all the research and so on. So yeah, picking them was quite difficult, because the more that you look around the world, like the second you start noticing abandoned places, you start seeing them everywhere. You know, like I see them all over the village where I live now, and every time I travel to a new place, I'm like, ooh, an abandoned car park, how exciting. You know, it's become my new favorite thing. I wonder what plants are growing here. So you do really start seeing them everywhere. And so it was that sort of mix of finding something that made sense as a part of the argument, as a thing that could fall into place, but also that sort of bigger sense of human story of and also somewhere I suppose that, I mean, it's a book, so it's all written, but it had to be somewhere, I think, for me, quite sort of aesthetically moving. You know, that's what I was looking for. So perhaps large in scale, or sort of, you know, I write a little bit in the book about how you have to sort of change your sense of aesthetics to be able to appreciate these places. And I do think that's true, but I also think that you always have that in you to be able to sort of feel dwarfed by a place or whatever. So I guess it was that mix.
Great. There's so much there I want to ask you about. I want to ask you about the islands. I want to ask you about succession. I want to ask you about aesthetics. So hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about all of them, but maybe it makes sense to just sort of keep with the basics, which is that, you know, islands is this word in your title. And so as I was reading your book, I couldn't help but think about the sort of the self-enclosure of islands, and how that self-enclosure has functioned in the literary imagination, right? So from, you know, Thomas More's Utopia to the Island of Dr. Moreau. And so I was kept kind of thinking about, gosh, islands really are these sort of really potent sites, both sort of in the literary world and in the biological world. And that it seems to lend themselves to both kind of utopian and dystopian possibilities, right? If we're taking kind of Thomas More and, you know, Dr. Moreau as our extreme examples. And I guess I was just wondering, you know, like in your, you know, based on your experience in going to these places, researching and writing about them, like, do you have a sense why? Like, why is it that islands inspire this sort of utopian and dystopian thinking? And where would you kind of situate your islands of abandonment in relation to this tradition?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question, because also islands are sort of this constant refrain in like the study of ecology. It's something that they come back to again and again. You know, you know, E.O. Wilson writes about them a lot, and it's become a big part of, you know, this enormous sort of biological theory. And I think the reason that islands are so interesting is because they offer us a sort of contained environment. They offer us an environment with like relatively little what's the word, sort of changing aspects that you can change. So it is something that you can model quite easily. So from a novelistic or fictional perspective, it gives you a contained cast, you know, and it gives you so many worries that these people have, and that kind of thing. So you can have like a fairly controllable politics within that storyline. From a biological perspective, kind of for a similar reason, they often offer really interesting case studies. And specifically, I've got a chapter on invasive species, and islands have been a huge sort of stomping ground for invasion biologists studying the impact of invasive species. And that's partly, again, because it's just sort of easier to study them there. You can tell when things come in and out. You can sort of measure them much more easily, and also you can try and attempt to rid a population from this containable area. I mean, I think what I came to think about my islands was that the locations in my book are all sort of islands, quote unquote, depending on what sort of sense I'm thinking of them. But what I came to see was that these are sort of islands in a great archipelago. So these are sort of wild islands, as I said, in this sort of sea of, for example, an urban environment or intensively managed farmland. But these wild islands in themselves, they might only be able to hold a small number of trees or a small number of plants. And what's in them tends to be quite random, because that's the pleasure of these places. You know, they're not being controlled by ecological managers. But they link together, and this all ties in with sort of ecological thinking of the way that if you have lots of small archipelagos in the past, this is where you found sort of the hotbeds of evolution. You can find populations sort of jumping from place to place. So if you have enough of these islands of wildness, you might find sort of populations spreading across the world. And we might hope that biodiversity can really not only be saved and find safe haven in these places, but that they can sort of jump from place to place and sort of change as they do so. Does that make sense? I think I too was sort of interested in that sort of like the appeal of islands emotionally and sort of philosophically. And also, I think that that's when I got really excited when I realized that it also tied into like the scientific way of thinking, and it just all came together in this like wonderful mix. And often I think that these scientific concepts in and of themselves are terribly, I mean, romantic is completely the wrong word, obviously, because that's not what they're meant to be, but just the existence and the names of many of these scientific concepts are just really affecting. I talk a bit about the ghosts of herbivory past in one section, when this, or even more generally, this idea of ecological memory in a landscape. And it's this sense that, for example, these cattle that might have been browsing in a field or not, what they eat has this sort of long-term impact on the future of that piece of land. And of course that makes sense if you think about, you know, the seeds that are left, or, you know, all of this, but also it has this incredibly sort of romantic sense to it that, depending on your personality, you're to take it.
Oh, I'm sorry, I lost you there. You broke up just a little bit. What did you, could you repeat the end again?
Oh, sure. I just said it sort of depends a little bit on your mindset and your personality, but you can take or leave these sort of poetic implications of the scientific terminology, but I certainly choose to take it.
Yeah, yeah. I felt the you know, I felt there was a kind of poetics to your ecological language running throughout the book, and one of the kind of you know, sort of languages of poetic languages that you had in the book was sort of a language of redemption running throughout it. Early on in the book, you say these are stories of redemption, not restoration. And for me, it was sort of kind of clearly signaling that maybe you were taking a different stance than the stance, say, of a kind of classic restoration ecologist. And I was wondering, for you know, for the purposes of kind of the general audience, maybe you could say a little bit about restoration ecology, and kind of and you know, talk a little bit about the difference that you see between redemption and restoration, and why you chose to highlight redemption.
Sure, absolutely. And I think I don't know, restoration ecology can be a little bit controversial depending on how you want to talk about it. But generally, I think the sense is that you come to a landscape that has been somehow ruined or greatly depleted by its past use by humans. And then the sense is to try and return it to some kind of, ideally, both aesthetically and ecologically sound location. And so the idea behind it is definitely a positive one, and I think that the people have worked very hard to try and turn sort of sites around. But one worry that sort of kept bubbling up, and more so the more I looked into this topic, was how in the past these sort of attempts to restore a place could be quite interventionist. And certainly we've learned a lot in the last few decades about how past attempts at restoration ecology have actually, in their own way, sort of caused a lot of damage. So I went to a place in Wales, near Swansea, in Swansea Vale, that had been in the past known as Copperopolis for the sort of copper smelting that they did in that area. And what that had left behind was a sort of slight sort of wasteland area where they'd kept all the sort of spoil from there. It's tinged with heavy metals, all of that kind of thing. And so what they'd done was, a few decades ago, or I think about a decade ago, they'd gone in, they planted lots of grasses, they'd flattened some of the hummocks, they'd made cycle trails through the area, and that's wonderful. And you know, returned it to an area of use for the local community, which is great. And I think you can measure the success of these projects in lots of different ways. But one trouble that they had was that these sort of copper or heavy metal tinged soils had offered these really unusual habitats for a specific kind of plants known as metallophyte plants, metal-loving plants. They're really interesting from a scientific perspective. They're pretty rare because these conditions don't arise very often naturally, although they do. And there's a fascinating history of how people have used these like metallophyte plants, specifically wildflowers, to like prospect for metals in wild places. So especially I know in Zambia, there's this area called the copper belts, and there are several different types of flowers that if you look for them, that means there's copper below, and the different kind of flowers suggest how like dense the copper, or how rich the copper might be in the soil beneath. So I think that's really interesting. And what had happened in this area in Wales was that when it had been restored, they'd sort of brought in a lot of topsoil from elsewhere, and it meant that these plants were sort of being pushed out by the more sort of generalist type of plants. And so the really interesting thing about this landscape, this place, was sort of being scrubbed out a little bit, which was a shame. And they were now sort of feeling a little bit of regret, you know, that the restoration that had happened on the site hadn't been more sympathetic and hadn't sort of kept some of these, I guess, the pollution. And they were thinking about scraping up the topsoil in some areas to try and retoxify the ground, to try and give these rare plants an opportunity to grow back. So I found that really interesting, and definitely, I suppose partly I wanted this book to be kind of a warning against the most interventionist methods. I mean, or certainly not necessarily to say that we shouldn't do them, but to say that we really need to weigh up our options very, very carefully, because often these wrecked environments can be very interesting in their own right, especially if they've been left for a very long period of time. You know, like as decades pass, they tend to be colonized. They tend to be colonized by stuff that suits the place rather than the stuff that gets brought in and is sort of propped up. So the Bings were a good example. You know, like some of them had been restored, they've been curbed to make them look a bit more like hills, they've been planted with wild grasses and things like this. And the ones that had been restored in those ways, using what's called like a traditional restoration methods, which was more to do with the aesthetics of the place, they actually were much sort of poorer in terms of biodiversity than the ones that had been left. And ones that had been managed for biodiversity itself, so really like concentrating on that one measure, they actually weren't any better than the ones that had been left to their own devices. And so I think to a certain extent, we certainly have to sort of respect that ability of plants to find niches for themselves to grow, and the same with wildlife, and try not to be too hands-on. And I suppose that was one of the things that I really wanted to sort of bring out in my book, because I know it's a strand of thought at the moment in that field of restoration, and certainly it's a debate that's been had quite a lot in conservation at the moment, and I wanted to bring that out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important, right? I mean, so much interesting work is being done around disturbance ecology. You talk about novel ecosystems, right? These ecosystems that spring up precisely because of the disturbance, of the damage, and then what happens when we kind of leave them alone, as you say. And I think I think your book really taps into some of those interesting debates around. I've heard them called emergent ecologies. I've heard them called novel ecologies. I've heard them called disturbance ecologies. There's lots of words out there, but I think they precisely are kind of getting at precisely what your book is doing. This sort of celebrating nature's power to reclaim and to kind of reroute in these places. So I really loved that focus in your book. But I guess I was just wondering if I could even kind of get you to talk even more about this language of redemption, and which even kind of takes on the language of salvation at a couple points. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read to you a couple quotes.
Yeah.
So for example, when you're talking about the reforestation of the abandoned farmland in Estonia, you say, quote, "What forest regrowth offers us is a chance to pay our debts, to atone for past sins." And then you go on and you're talking about the way these forests serve as carbon sequestration. And you say it's hard not to see it as, quote, "anything other than divine providence, an act of forgiveness on planetary scale, or of self-sacrifice, as the earth shields us bodily from our worst excesses." And sorry, just one more that I really loved. And then later on, you're visiting the graveyard, the ship graveyard off the coast of Staten Island, which is sort of this horrific site of toxicity and pollution. And you write, "Here in the Museum of Abandoned Industry, that anything continues to survive and the toxic water at my feet strikes me as beyond fortunate, an act of divine providence, a gesture of forgiveness on a grand scale. And so I couldn't help but really kind of latch on to these moments of kind of a language of kind of sin and salvation, and forgiveness, right? That the earth kind of has the power to forgive. And I guess I would love to hear you talk about kind of what prompted you to use this language of sin and salvation, and maybe, just talk a bit about this idea that the earth has the power to forgive, which I love.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think this is definitely one of the ways in which I probably mark myself out from scientific discussion, and certainly probably wouldn't necessarily be approved of by many of the scientists that I quote. But certainly, I don't know. I mean, I'm not, in fact, a religious person or a Christian person, but that's not to say one doesn't retain the religious upbringing that you've had. And certainly I feel very much that my Church of Scotland upbringing has very much impacted on the way that I view the world, for better or for worse. But that sort of vagueness, like, not religious, I'm spiritual, I think a lot of people do feel that. And I think that that tied in a little bit with what I was getting at when we talked about boundaries blurring, when I was trying to picture the impact of radiation upon the body and how it passes through in the sense of greater forces beyond yourself. I mean, not to get too woo-woo, I'm not really a very woo-woo person, but it is I think that I keep leaning on this language in the way that many of us find this idea, James Lovelock's Gaia theory so attractive. So this idea that the planet is some kind of giant self-righting system, a sort of super organism that has the ability to sort of make itself better when it gets sick, or to fight off, the depredations of man as if it was were some kind of virus. It's not necessarily that one is talking literally, but it is, I think, a way of thinking and a way of feeling and a way of navigating the world. And when I rely so heavily, I think, upon the sort of emotional impact of traveling to a place, of learning about it and so on, that this is where my mind goes to, that this sense of something greater than myself, whether or not it has a sort of sense of control, or if these are just feedback mechanisms that at any moment might spin out of hand. I think it often biologists come back to these as metaphors. We've talked about the Gaia theory, and then there's a sort of evil opposite, which is the Medea theory, both of them being offered not so much as genuine theories, although Lovelock is Lovelock put forward a complex theory, but the Medea theory particularly is offered almost as a thought experiment. So it's to help us picture these forces at work, and I think that that's what I'm getting at when I'm talking about redemption. It's this sense that we could be in this sort of mortal danger, and yet we might have within ourselves, or the planet might within itself, the power to save itself. It's a powerful image, certainly to me, and I think that biblical language is always something that has echoed. And I think many of my favorite writers, I mean, I'm thinking of, I suppose, like Cormac McCarthy and people like this, often they have that same prosody of comes from the King James Bible. I think, that it's that way that you fall back on when you're talking about things greater than yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, I think for me, it was powerful in kind of two different directions. Like, on one hand, it was powerful because it highlighted, human culpability. It highlights the things that we've done wrong, right? It this idea that we have sinned against the earth in some way, right? Which I think, there's sort of no getting around that. No matter how hopeful or optimistic your book ultimately is, right? Like, you never go so far as to like let us off the hook, right? You're never like, oh no, it's fine. And you're like, no, actually, like, these are real problems. So I mean, I appreciated that the language of sinfulness kind of kept that kind of culpability in view, while on the other hand, at the same time, you're also sort of granting the earth agency and power. You're kind of giving the non-human world, I think a kind of I wouldn't go so far as to call it a voice, but certainly a power, right? Like, there's a power to the non-human world, which I think is such an important corrective to anthropocentrism and, and the Anthropocene, all of that. So I really appreciated, actually, right? I think I could tell that you weren't actually like, you're not pushing a religious agenda, but you have this, I think there's some larger questions at play around kind of morality and,
right. And I think that the way that we talk about the environment and climate almost always is tinged with this moralistic underpinnings, right? We often think of sort of humans as the original sin. I think it's all kind of tied in with the way that we think of wilderness as being these unsullied Edens, like I think this is kind of faulty thinking, but at the same time, it's so stitched in with the way that we feel about these places. It's actually very difficult not to talk in that sort of way. And also, I think, yeah, obviously I think climate change is obviously the eschatology of our age, as we talk about at the end. And that's not to say that it's not happening. It's just that this is the way that it appeals to us narratively, and I think it's very difficult to talk about in the environment and planetary events without sort of reverting to that way of thinking, and it's powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I mean, the arc of your book, right, there is such a clear arc, I think, and by the end of it, you do kind of, there is a kind of almost apocalyptical, right, language at work in those final two chapters. So there, I guess this brings me to a question, a couple different questions, but one that I really am dying to ask you, actually, is at one point, and this is in the chapter on invasive species. You say, in so many places, we are so busy playing at being stewards of the earth, deciding who gets to live and who gets to die. Once we have left our mark on an ecosystem, we show no hesitation in throwing open the bonnet again, later to fiddle with its workings. And then we run the earth as if it were one giant botanical garden to tend, passing judgment on species playing God. So again, the sort of religious language coming in, but also this question of stewardship and question of intervention. And I couldn't help but wonder, after reading your entire book, do you think it's possible for humans to be good stewards to the earth?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, because I think there's two aspects of that, right? Which is, one of them is, inarguably, humans have had a major impact on the planet, absolutely. But I also slightly reject this concept of stewardship, in which we often talk about, and especially I think in the context of conservation, this idea of being like some kind of responsible owner of the planet. And I think, we are moving away from that sense of us being the bosses and everyone else being sort of, all the other animals being parts of our animal kingdoms, and all the plants being part of some vast garden for us. But it is very much, it's a way of thinking that is sown into that field, and even into like efforts to rewild and so on, because rewilding has aims and objectives, like even this concept of having aims and objectives for the planet, and for how we want to sort of see a better planet and how we want to be better stewards. If we are saying, then we need to do this and we need to do that, I don't know, I'm a little bit uneasy about it, I think, is where I'm coming from. I think partly because I know in the past, when we've been doing things with the best of intentions, it hasn't always had the best results. And so I think one thing we need to do is sort of temper our confidence in our ability to be stewards of the planet, temper our longing to be a steward of the planet and a responsible owner. So I think that's where I'm getting at with that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm with you. I have my own. I'm wary too of our Promethean desires to play God, and the unintended consequences that so often seem to spring up when we do play God. And so I think I'm also wary of that. But I think there's a real human desire to want to take action. And I think one of the most profound and wonderful kind of takeaways of your book is in a sense that you're advocating inaction, in a sense, or at least a kind of, or at least, like let nature do its thing a bit, right? And so I guess I'm kind of wondering if you would maybe talk to us about, right, because at one point you talk about that these sites, one of the benefits is that they show us the value of surrendering control, is your phrase. And I guess I would love to hear what you think about this, because right at the same time, the last line of your book is like, I think it's like, we need to find the faith to fight, is sort of like the last line. And so there seems to be a bit of a tension between surrendering control and yet somehow fighting. And I was wondering if you would maybe talk about that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, well, yeah, definitely that part about sort of learning to surrender. It's sort of that sort of, if you think of a sort of romantic equivalent of, if you love someone, to let them go, that sort of, how can we structure a way of conservation or something which involves completely letting go, like, and is that the best way forward, and I think that when we come to, we must find faith enough to fight, I think like in part that I'm talking about the way that we deal with the human aspect, which is that we continue to pollute, that emissions are wildly out of control and they're going up enormous amounts. Like to turn that ship around will take a great deal of energy. And so it's not enough to say, cool, fill your boots, go for it. Like it's not, I'm not sort of arguing for some kind of environmental anarchism in which we're all allowed to pollute as much as we want, and because the earth can recover, then fine. I think the scale that the degradation of the planet continues to happen in such a scale that the forces of redemption are not able to act fast enough. And so there are two competing tensions here, which I think is probably the best thing for the planet would be if, huge areas were allowed to regrow trees, and probably not be planted, but actually to regrow themselves, because certainly the power is there. And that has enormous implications in terms of carbon storage, and huge amounts of forests are growing back. But if we continue to emit carbon and other greenhouse gases at such a scale, all the forests growing in all the world could not offset that. So we do need to take action, and the action we need to take is to slow down consumption and to, switch from carbon energies. And all of this does involve a fight. There are so many various vested interests in not doing that. And so I think it's a sort of, what can we call it? A sort of managed surrender in terms of land, or once ground has fallen into abandonment. I think one of the things that I really love about the abandoned places is that they have happened almost of their own accord. I grew up in the Highlands of Scotland, and we have this sort of great sort of shadow on our history of the Highland clearances, which is when people were cleared off the land in enormous numbers. And that's one of the reasons why Scotland is such a beautiful, wild, areas of it are still rather quite empty. But that was at an enormous human cost. And I don't think that is what I'm fighting for. I don't think I would ever advocate for the forcible removal of people from land so that we could let it go wild. I think the thing that appeals to me about the abandoned places is that other forces have allowed them to become abandoned, and then if we can sort of fence them off and keep them, they're valueless now, so let's fence them, and then we stop people moving back on them. I think that there's some kind of really lovely aspect of that it makes it sort of easy. These grounds have been surrendered, so we hand them over, and we don't get to take them back. This is a sort of way of thinking, I guess. Sorry, I think I'm getting a little bit off track.
No, that's perfect. I mean, I think it really, and it chimes with E.O. Wilson's idea of sort of the half Earth, right? That we need to kind of give over half the Earth to wildlife if we want to have a chance of sort of surviving. So, I mean, I see how it kind of fits in with other ecological arguments. But I wanted to weave in a question from the audience. There have been a couple interesting questions. Are there places that you wanted to visit or did visit but didn't make the cut for the book? Asks Stefan.
That's a really good question, because yes and no. Basically, places that I really want to go. As I say, you know, like once you start looking into it, more and more places bubble up and you have to sort of draw a line somewhere. And often where I drew a line was when I knew they would be sort of narratively necessary. And also where I knew that I definitely had the research and sort of literary references and so on to be able to write. I mean, the way that I write is quite sort of dense in terms of both scientific but also sort of literary writing and research. So what I know is a weakness of the book is that it is sort of weighted towards the Anglophone world because I had access to the scientific research and also the sort of past historical writing about these places. I mean, I went to Tanzania, but at some stage that had been part of the British Empire. And so there is sort of some stuff that is available in English. And I found people who could translate and so on. And so when you start going to multiple places in the non-Anglophone world, just from a practical point of view, the expenses can be enormous. And you might get there and then still not have enough material without hiring sort of on the ground researchers to do it all for you. And I don't know, I've got quite what's the word? So like a not vague, but sort of spread out way of researching, which is often you don't know what you're looking for until you find it, right? And so like hiring a researcher to be like, can you read until you find interesting stuff? I mean, that's just not a way that you can work. And I think in future, I would certainly like to figure out a better way of doing it so I mean, there's a huge amount of abandoned land in China. There's a great deal of abandoned settlements in Russia. I know a lot, like actually really amazing looking places, which I'm desperate to go to. And of course in Africa as well. I mean, I did an interview with a travel writer, Sophie Roberts, who has traveled a lot in Africa. And she said specifically in the Congo, there were loads of places that she thinks I would love to go and see. And partly that was just, I didn't know about them. And I think hopefully I'm just going to be writing about this topic kind of from here on in, you know, like for various publications. So yeah, I definitely, there are lots of places I wanted to visit, almost kind of too many to name, and hopefully I will get the opportunity to write about them in the not distant future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was thinking about that too. And there must be no shortage of abandoned places in the world. And also sort of interesting historical ones too. I was sort of thinking about Easter Island as being, you know, sort of a historical example of kind of ecological devastation and then abandonment. But I wonder, I think we might have a question for one more audience question. Sam asks, what was the most striking thing you saw in Chernobyl?
Ooh, basically everything in Chernobyl is extremely striking and shaky, you know, that makes you feel shaky. So I went to Chernobyl first of all the locations in the book, I think because it's kind of the poster child for the phenomenon I'm looking at, in as much as it's a huge exclusion zone and it's not literally an island, so it was recolonized quite quickly by wildlife because they could sort of sweep in. And the ecological story there, as many people know, is kind of amazing in terms of, you know, I think it's a 7-fold increase in wolves and bears arrived there after more than a century of not being there and so on and so forth. So I went there first. The first thing that really struck me was that it is weirdly easy to get in. You can arrive in Kiev and basically find a guide to take you within 24 hours. I booked in advance, but when I got there, I was like, oh, loads of people are going. You know, so you can go in and you can stay, as I did, overnight, and they've got quite a relaxed attitude about health and safety, I'd say, because you come in and they have these are they Soviet era? They certainly look Soviet era radiation scanners, and you pass in on the way out and you pass in on the way back. And, you know, all the people who are working on the decommissioned plant do so too. And it's like a full body scanner, presumably with a kind of Geiger counter inside. And yeah, they look pretty dated and nobody's really paying attention. Certainly the kind of places that your average visitor will go, it won't be incredibly radioactive anymore. But if you're traveling, so places like the Red Forest and so on, you need to be there as a scientist to get those particular permissions. I think the most striking things to me was I don't know, the whole experience of being there was like being in a disaster movie. It really is. You know, there's a supermarket and the trolleys are everywhere and they're rusted together. And you know, you go into apartment blocks. You know, in theory you're not meant to go in, but apparently all the visitors do. And there are so many of them that, you know, many of them look fairly, you know, they've been stripped for valuables, but otherwise they're fairly untouched. And the shells of the building, because of the era that it was built, tend to be quite solid still. You know, they're built of concrete, so you can go up and down stairs, although the floorboards in the actual rooms themselves are very wobbly. And so there's lots of paperwork around. We went into a school in which textbooks were scattered and were like ankle deep, you know, that probably at some stage by looters or by visitors. You get the sense of these people who have moved through these places before you. You're not going to be the first person to go to almost any abandoned place unless you somehow have a key, because there is such a culture of urban exploring, and specifically in Chernobyl they have these people who are inspired by this video game Stalker. So people will break in and sort of camp out there for a few days at a time, and so a lot of these people have gone in, and of course looters. So you have this sense of people in some undisclosed time that have been there before you, and so that can be quite frightening. And you know, there's gas masks everywhere that have been scattered, probably by people taking photos, and you know that to be true, but it's still quite a sort of confronting thing to do. And you know, all of their sports facilities are huge. They were pretty much brand new at the time of the incident, so they're in kind of good condition. And I don't know. It was like being in a film. I do, in a weird way, recommend that people go. You know, if I understand it might not appeal to everyone, but it's surprisingly easy to go, and it does really, I think, bring the reality of what happened in Chernobyl, and specifically that sort of human tragedy of the people who were rehomed in such enormous numbers. I think it really does bring it home, being able to be there in the zone and to see visually the sense of time passing and the scale of the number of lives that were affected.
Wonderful. Well, I realize we've now officially gone over, so I suppose I can't ask you all my other questions, but it was such an absolute pleasure to speak with you about this amazing, wonderful book. I think everyone should go out immediately and read it. I think it will offer a little bit of hope in a dark time, and so I strongly urge you to read it. But thank you so much. You know, I clap for you. I know that it's not quite the same as an actual live event, but thank you so much, Cal, for being here with us and sharing your wonderful work with us.
Thank you, Ella. Thanks for some wonderful questions. It was really such a pleasure to be here tonight. So thank you.